Before we start, I'd like to note that many of the casualty figures are estimates. It seems that every World War II historian has his own idea of how many died on both sides of the German-Russian conflict. We should keep in mind that our goal is to find out why the Germans and their Axis partners lost fewer men killed than the Russians. I purposely left out the sick and wounded, unless they later died. If you feel my casualty figures are way off, please note it in the comments section with a backup reference. The Soviet casualty numbers are somewhat off because they include their navy. Since the Soviets weren't a major naval power, this won't interfere with our ultimate goal. So, if you add the conscripted and pre-war Soviet army, then you'll have roughly 34,477,000 total soldiers for the war. Then you take the 12,840,000 Soviet soldiers in June 1945 and subtract them, you'll have a difference of 21,637,000. Then you subtract the POWs that weren't later reconscripted, those discharged, reservists that were killed before they were officially inducted, and you get 7,825,000 Soviet soldiers that were killed in action. If you add the POWs that died in German captivity, then you'll get 8,668,400, but for our purposes, because we want to count battle deaths, that number will be ignored. On the German side, we have a relatively good accounting of the deaths on the Eastern Front. Up until the end of 1944, it was 2,742,909. In 1945, records weren't kept so well, but if we take 2/3 of the total deaths in 1945, we get 811,829 deaths. The Soviets claim that there were over 1 million German deaths on their front in 1945, and this was close to the probable number. If we add these two together, we get a German Eastern Front death total of 3,554,738. Russian military historian G.I. Krivosheev, working independently and with alternate sources, stated that German and Hiwi deaths on the Eastern Front was 4,352,100. Here are the German conscription totals from 1939 to 1945. When we add the total German dead and the Axis partners, then it comes to roughly 4,257,045. If you remember, Krivosheev's number was 4,352,100, and the difference between the two numbers is around 95,000. Nevertheless, we'll move forward with the 4,257,045 number. Simply put, if we add POWs to the equation, it skews the number significantly. POWs have nothing to do with battle deaths. This quote is accurate, but only if you include POWs who died in captivity. When you look at the overall deaths, the Russians died at 1.8 for every German soldier, whether on the offensive or defensive. Why is this? The Germans got off to a strong start in the first 6 months with relatively few casualties. If they had continued at that pace, they would have won the war. In 1942, the casualty rates of about 2-to-1 represented a rough equilibrium of Soviet versus Axis forces. After that, the Soviet loss rate, approaching 1-to-1, was less than their manpower resupply, which is why they ultimately won. The Germans had superior tactical doctrine, Auftragstaktik. The emphasis is on the outcome of the mission rather than specific means of achieving it. Basically, a higher level commander gives the junior leader an overall task, the troops and resources, and a time period. The junior leader figures out the tactics and the best way to do it. For the most part, Russians had inept officers. The regular frontовики could show bravery on a local level, but had no idea of the bigger plan. German leadership, which has to do with tactics, was better at all levels. The only Soviet generals that were exceptional were Zhukov and Konev. The German army provided better medical care for its wounded soldiers, so there were fewer fatalities. Stalin destroyed his officer corps. Many Russian officers at the beginning of the war were either inexperienced or political appointees. Eventually this was rectified, but this harmed Russian strategy and tactics. For many reasons, the Red Army was not an effective fighting force in the beginning. The early days of the war were largely a one-sided affair, where the German army's biggest challenge was dealing with tens or hundreds of thousands of surrendering Soviet troops. As time progressed, the Soviets regrouped and pushed back. In 1941, the Germans had the advantages of surprise preparedness and superior tactical doctrine. In 1942, the Germans had lost the first two advantages, but their superior doctrine still made the difference. By 1943, the Soviet forces had caught up, and in some cases overtaken the Germans in quality of equipment and doctrine to a sufficient degree to be able to win with a 2-to-1 numerical advantage. This is similar to General Grant in the American Civil War against General Lee in 1864-65. Initially, the Germans were better prepared. After the Battle of Moscow, this was no longer the case. The Russians were also in seriously bad shape in the winter of 1941, but they were recovering. In the early part of the war, Stalin constantly interfered with strategy. He ordered Zhukov to counterattack, which wasted precious reserves. Eventually Stalin stopped this, but it took a few years. When the Germans shifted to the defensive on the Eastern Front, they were able to inflict higher casualties, even though they were outnumbered. Generally, with everything else being equal, the defensive army usually has fewer casualties. Operation Bagration was a massive exception to this. Russian tactics in the beginning of the war were very bad. An all-out, full-charging, screaming attack is wonderful, if it works. If not, then the bodies will pile up. Eventually the Russians changed their tactics toward the end of the war. The Russian front was a massive conflict. Leningrad was under siege for nearly 3 years. The Battle of Stalingrad ground on for months and killed over 2 million. Kursk was an epic battle that was the turning point of the war. From that point forward, the Germans were on the defensive and engaged in a long battle of attrition all the way back to Berlin. If you liked what you see, hit the subscribe button or share. Thank you. This has been EmersusTech.